Thanks, Bella. Hello. So we've taken a break from Acts over the summer. And I think the last time we had a talk on Acts was when Charles spoke about Paul being warned what was awaiting him when he was going to Jerusalem, but that he went nevertheless. And when Paul arrived in Jerusalem, he tells the church what he's seen and what he's done, and they're very glad to hear all this. But they tell him that the Jewish believers in Jerusalem are zealous for the law. And they're concerned that they've heard that Paul has been teaching people that Jewish traditions don't matter. And the church then suggests that Paul join in and sponsor the purification rites for some Jewish believers to show that he was not against Christians following Jewish customs and laws. So that's what Paul does. So that's where we pick up the story, and we're in Acts chapter 21, verses, I'm going to read from 26 to 37. And I'm reading it in the New Living Translation. So Paul went to the temple the next day with the other men. They had already started the purification ritual, so he publicly announced the date when their vows would end and sacrifices would be offered for each of them. The 7 days were almost ended when some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple and roused a mob against him. They grabbed him, yelling, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who preaches against our people everywhere and tells everybody to disobey the Jewish laws. He speaks against the temple and even defiles this holy place by bringing in Gentiles." For earlier that day, they had seen him in the city with Trophimus, a Gentile from Ephesus, and they assumed Paul had taken him into the temple. The whole city was rocked by these accusations, and a great riot followed. Paul was grabbed and dragged out of the temple, and immediately the gates were closed behind him. As they were trying to kill him, word reached the commander of the Roman regiment that all Jerusalem was in uproar. He immediately called out his soldiers and officers and ran down among the crowd. When the mob saw the commander and the troops coming, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander arrested him and ordered him bound with 2 chains. He asked the crowd who he was and what he had done. Some shouted one thing and some another. Since he couldn't find out the truth in all the uproar and confusion, he ordered that Paul be taken to the fortress. As Paul reached the stairs, the mob grew so violent, the soldiers had to lift him up to their shoulders to protect him. And the crowd followed behind, shouting, "Kill him, kill him." So when we start at the beginning of this passage, we've got Paul trying to appease the Jewish believers who were zealous for the law by joining in with and financing Jewish purification rites at the temple. And whether this would have been enough to have pleased them and to win over the Jewish believers, we'll never find out, because some of the Jews from Asia, who would also probably have called themselves zealous for the law, are also at the temple. And they see him and they accuse him of speaking against their people, against their laws, and against the temple. They've obviously come across Paul on his missionary journeys, or at least heard about them. And they've come to some really bad conclusions about him and what he stands for. Like these accusations that they bring against Paul, these are really grave. He's accused of speaking against the Jewish people, their laws, and the temple. And these things basically sum up the identity of the Jewish people. So he was seen as attacking the things that they held the most dear. But none of it was true. Paul had never told Jewish believers to abandon their customs. He had just been clear that new believers, Gentiles, did not need to become Jewish or follow their traditions in order to follow Jesus. But gossip and bad reputation, however unfounded, can get you in a lot of trouble. They also accuse him of bringing a Gentile into the holy place in the temple. And this is something that was forbidden but also apparently untrue. There's no evidence that Paul took a Gentile into the out of bounds area of the temple. And it would have been completely out of character. He knew the law, and he had demonstrated again and again that he would act as a Jew to the Jews in order to win them to the gospel, not least right here in this passage by observing a Jewish custom, specifically for the purpose of showing these Jewish believers that he respected their customs. He would have understood how offensive this act would have been to the Jews, so he would have avoided doing it. But it seems like it was just assumed because he'd been seen in Jerusalem with Gentiles, they'd assumed he'd taken them in. Now, when I was reading this passage, I was reminded of a question that I came across the other day. It was something to do with farming, actually. But the question was, what is more important to you, your reputation or your character? And I think we'd really love it, and it would be a lot easier if these two things went hand in hand. But sadly, that's not necessarily the case. In his letter to the Romans, Paul writes, "Give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all." So Paul certainly does encourage us to think about how we appear to others, and to act in a way that we would be considered good. Paul is always conscious that he is an ambassador for Jesus, and he wants to glorify him only by always bringing honor to his name. And this is really important. The commandment to not take the Lord's name in vain isn't only about avoiding using a few words, avoiding certain phrases. It's about not bringing his name into disrepute as well. We carry and we represent his name as believers. So we need to be acting in a way that reflects his character. But even considering all this, how much thought Paul obviously gives this, his reputation is in pieces. Paul had a better reputation when he was persecuting Christians than he did when he became a Christian himself. And Paul, he's had this amazing encounter with Jesus, and his character was being sanctified and shaped by God, but his name was mud amongst the Jews. Isn't it ironic that at the time of his life, when Paul was the most in step with God, that he was the most hated by others who professed to follow the same God? Even with our very best efforts, we can't always maintain a good reputation. But with God, we can develop good character. And that is one of the most precious things I believe we can have, and one of the most honoring things to God, whether it is recognized by others or not. Now, it's significant in this passage that in the course of the riot, Paul is dragged out of the temple, and it says the temple gates were shut. As Tom Wright says, Paul was never going to set foot in that temple again, and within the next 50 years, the temple was destroyed forever. And now, as I was reading my study Bible, it led me to the second book of Kings, where at one point there's a queen mother called Athaliah, and she takes over by force when her son, King Ahaziah probably, died. And when the rightful king is then presented in the temple, she comes into the temple and she accuses them all of treason. But she is removed from the temple, and the priest said, "Let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord." So I think it's reasonable to think that Paul was shut out as no one wanted bloodshed in the temple. But this phrase about the temple gates being shut, it also made me think about the barriers that the Jewish people had put up against the Gentiles, and often against people of God. Of course, when God was establishing the nation of Israel, he had told them to keep separate from the other nations so that they wouldn't be led astray by them. And there is a time for that. And the rules about who could go in to which part of the temple reflect this. But ever since Abraham's days, God had been speaking about blessing the whole world through his chosen people. And many of the prophets speak about other nations streaming into Zion. And the importance of welcoming the alien or the stranger is repeated again and again in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The accusations against Paul, that he was against the people, against their laws, and against their temple, highlight the focus of the Jewish people. It was very inward looking. So much so that they did not always recognize the hand of God when it was working in new ways and through different people. And as I read this passage for the first time, the sentence that this sentence about the gates being shut, it brought to mind those things that we can shut out of church or want to shut out of church, and those things that we can let in. I'm sure the priests and the Jewish people would have loved to shut Jesus out of the temple when he was turning over those tables, and when he was accusing them of turning the house of God into the den of robbers. That probably hit a little close to home. And we must be careful that we don't shut out voices that challenge from the church. We must be careful not to get so comfortable in our experience of God, even if we would call ourselves zealous for the law, even when we are faithful to our understanding of God, that we don't lack discernment and fail to recognize truth when it walks in, even when it's challenging or comes from a very unexpected source. So here we have Paul shut out of the temple and about to be murdered by a mob. And who should come to the rescue but the Romans? It's funny that Paul's arrest, which would normally be seen as a punishment, is actually what rescued him. And it is strange that one of God's elect, who is trying to follow God's call, is protected by those outside the faith. The Romans were seen as the enemy. They were the occupying force who were oppressing the Jewish people. And yet here they save Paul, God's servant. Now, as we're reading Acts, we've been reading commentary by Tom Wright alongside, which has been really good. It kind of opens up more of the scripture. And he says about this passage, the God who called the pagan Cyrus to rescue Israel from Babylon can and will use Roman justice for all its glaring faults to show in advance that Paul has done nothing worthy of death. Learn to hear the story in these terms and to wrestle with today's complex problems of faith, politics, justice, and loyalty with new courage and hope. I thought that was quite apt for our day. It's probably apt for every day. Of course, there are times when the powers that be on earth are in direct opposition to what God's people stand for. But amazingly, there are times when God uses that which is not spiritual for his purposes. In this passage from Tom Wright's book, he refers to King Cyrus, who Isaiah explains was commissioned by God to release the Jews from captivity in Babylon. How can it be that people who do not recognize God for who he is can be used for his purposes? I often think about the triumphal entry when Jesus rides on the donkey into Jerusalem, not long before he is crucified. And he's challenged to stop those who are praising him from praising him in such strong terms. And he says, if they don't, then the rocks will cry out. This world and its people are not fully what they were made to be, and yet God does still use them. The creation is broken, but God can still bring forth praise from it, because the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all its people belong to him. And I wonder if it is the same with the people that God made. Even though they don't recognize him, sometimes they can play a part in his plan. To be honest, when I read this passage, I thought this is not the easiest one to talk on. And the ideas that it brings up are not that straightforward. Tom Wright says we have to wrestle with these complex problems of faith, politics, justice, and loyalty. The passage brings up questions like, why does good character not always bring about good reputation? And vice versa, why does bad character not always bring about bad reputation? How can those who are zealous for the word sometimes just get it so wrong? How can we be one with our fellow believers and yet bring challenge and truth like Jesus and Paul did, and the prophets? And how can our enemies be used in God's plans? But the end of this passage reminds us very much of another episode in the New Testament, when another person was targeted by an angry mob. And the Roman authorities seemed to be the voice of reason against religious zeal. And of course, I'm referring to the story of Jesus's trial and crucifixion. Perhaps the best comfort we can get when we're wrestling with so many questions is to know that Jesus once lived in this world full of complexities, and that he faced the same challenges we face. And that even the Son of God walked to an extent within the confines of this earth's limits for a time. Jesus knew what it was to have a spotless character and yet a dreadful reputation amongst religious circles. He knew what it was like to be shut out from the community of believers because he brought too much challenge. He knew what it was like when people were supposed to be his enemies actually treated him better than some of his fellow Jews. And he recognized the parts that everyone had to play in the plans of God. So what did he have to say about this complicated world that we live in? He told his believers, and I believe he tells us today, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus endured so much trouble, and yet he overcame. And because of him and what he has done, and who he can be to us and in us, then we too can overcome. We can overcome the world around us, but we can also overcome the world within us, those bits that creep in. And when we do, we'll be walking in step with God. And somehow everything will work together for good. And I think we'll recognize it more, just as Jesus could speak respectfully to Pontius Pilate. So I'm going to finish with a prayer. Thank you so much, Jesus, that you came and lived in this complicated mess that we've made. I thank you that you got down into the mud with us. I thank you that we will never go through anything that you didn't go through. And I thank you that we'll never go through anything that you won't overcome. Lord, I thank you that one day everything will be made right. Creation, your people, everything will be set right. And we look forward to that day. But Lord, I also thank you that you can start to change things now. And I pray that we would allow you to overcome the world in us, in our immediate circles, in our workplace, our homes, that we would let you start along that path, to lead us along that path. I thank you for examples like Paul. I thank you for your word. And I thank you for those today who are also examples to us. But I particularly think of Godfrey. Pray you would bless him. I lift him up to you now. Lord, just thank you for being who you are and help us to learn more of your ways and to trust you and your good plans for us. Amen.